There's a little bit with these four where it's like that subreddit, like draw the rest of the freaking owl. Have you ever seen that? Where it's like it's making fun of like like those like drawing instructions, like how to draw an owl. It's like step 1, draw a circle. Step 2, draw the rest of the freaking owl. Like, and
Right.
there's a little bit of that with here. Like, you're all your team topologies now. Granted, here's what you need first. It lists like these 4 incredibly difficult to achieve things. Hey there, welcome to Book Overflows, the podcast for software engineers by software engineers, where every week we read one of the best technical books in the world in an effort to improve our craft. I am Carter Morgan, and I'm joined here, as always, by my co-host, Nathan Toups. How are you doing, Nathan?
Doing great. Hey, everybody.
Well, as always, wherever you're following along, if it's on YouTube, you can like, comment, or subscribe. If you're on an audio platform, you can leave a 5-star review. Helps the podcast grow, promotes us in the algorithm. You know how it all works. But as always, the most helpful thing you can do is share it in real life. Share it with your coworkers on Slack. Share it with your friends who are interested in software. Share it with your mentors, your mentees, whoever you think would benefit from this podcast. Because as the audience grows, we're able to do cooler and cooler stuff. And we are excited about what we're going to talk about today. We think it's already cool. We're covering the back half of Team Topologies by Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais. We'll give you just a quick introduction on the book and then the authors. Team Topologies, described as effective software teams, are essential for any organization to deliver value continuously and sustainably. But how do you build the best team organization for your specific goals, cultures, and needs? Team Topologies is a practical step-by-step adaptive model for organizational design and team interaction based on 4 fundamental team types and 3 team interaction patterns. It is a model that treats teams as the fundamental means of delivery, where team structures and communication pathways are able to evolve with technological and organizational maturity. And our authors, Matthew Skelton and Manuel Pais. Matthew Skelton, he's the head of consulting at Conflux. He specializes in continuous delivery, operability, and organization dynamics for software and manufacturing, e-commerce, and online services, including cloud, IoT, and embedded software. Manuel Pais, he is not only the co-author of Team Topologies, but he's also the co-author of Organizing Business and Technology. Oh, wait, sorry, that's just the subtitle for Team Topologies. I'm sure he's written many other cool things. But he is recognized by Tech Beacon as the DevOps thought leader. Manuel is an independent IT organizational consultant and trainer focused on team interactions, delivery practices, and accelerating flow. He's also a LinkedIn instructor on continuous delivery for the enterprise. So this book, they're consultants. You can tell that this book was written by consultants. I don't even mean that in a bad way. It's just it's a very consultant-y book. So last week we read parts 1 and 2. We are up to part 3 now. So and that takes us to the end of the book. Nathan, give us your thoughts on part 3 and I guess Team Topologies as a whole.
Yeah, part 3 is not that long, but there's a lot of power in the punch. I think that the case studies, the detailed action plan on how you actually can start implementing this was super useful. And of course, you needed the first 2 parts to make it make sense. But they give you a lot of breakdowns of like real world ways a team has overcome problems or issues with how they are shipping code by adopting the team topology methodology and how to take this incremental approach. I thought it was really valuable, and it gave me a few like aha moments when I was like, okay, well, how do I actually do this in real life?
Yeah, it's one thing I really appreciate about this book. It does a great job kind of summarizing its contents. Like at the end of every chapter, it'll be like, okay, here are the key takeaways. And like you said, Nathan, it packs a punch. I found this book very dense in a good way. And it's interesting to read a very dense management book. I think you read like Building Evolutionary Architectures, which is probably what is ChatGPT doing and why does it work is probably the densest book we've read, but Building Evolutionary Architectures is a close second. And not only is it dense, but it covers a wider breadth than the ChatGPT book. But anyhow, you kind of expect a book like that to be pretty dense because it's covering so many different challenging technical topics. Very cool to read a book that there was nothing in here that I really had trouble wrapping my head around. But still very dense and very, very efficient in how it communicates. it's definitely geared towards management. Like I said, this book is management, or someone who has a say in how teams are organized. I guess I would frame it that way. It was written by consultants. It sounds like it's written by consultants. There's a few things out there that they say that, like, I know I've seen on like Reddit posts where people say like, "Oh my gosh, can you believe that management said this?" I'm like, "Yeah, I know where management got that from. It was Team Topologies." I think if you're very like anti-jargon, you might roll your eyes at some of this, but I don't think that's necessarily a problem with the book. I think sometimes that's just the way we talk about things in business. And just you wouldn't read Building Evolutionary Architectures and be mad at how technical it sounds. And in the same way, I think if you read this and are mad at how consultancy it sounds, it's like, well, that's just the kind of book you're reading. But something to know as you just
Yeah.
if you had to read this book.
To tap into that a bit too, this gets into some things that Kent Beck had talked about, which is, understanding these philosophies and sort of evangelizing some of these ideas. Sometimes these kind of books can get a bad rep because someone who doesn't, they notice that there's a dysfunction in the organization. They're looking for a way to solve it, and they haven't actually solved this problem before, but they read a book about it.
Yeah,
and so they're trying to come in authoritative and be like, oh no, if we restructure this way, we can do this inverse Conway maneuver, and we can, fix all the dysfunction in the company. And unless you really have buy-in from leadership, you will be a failure, right? Unless you actually can get sponsorship within the organization, you can't overcome the dysfunction on your own always. And I think that's where some of these will get a bad rep, is maybe a middle manager is like, hey, we can fix this. And then they kind of fail, right? And it's not Team Topologies thing. It's like, you could do this with anything. Like, oh, let's use Go to make a microservice, or let's use test-driven development, right? Anything that's kind of like an ism or a philosophy. If the people who try to implement it don't fully understand it or don't know how to overcome some of the pitfalls, I think a misimplemented version of things that you're trying to affect change in can kind of blow up in your face, and then people kind of point and say, oh yeah, see, this thing never works. That kind of.
There's a little bit of like wet streets cause rain going on here, because you're like, oh, I worked at a place and it was, chaotic and hectic, and they were trying to do Team Topologies there, and it's like, well, I mean, maybe you're just working at a place that was chaotic and hectic and didn't have, the capacity to implement something like this. And we'll talk about it later on, but chapter 8 is all about like, hey, this book isn't sufficient for having a stellar engineering culture. There's a lot of other things that go into that we don't talk about in this book that you need to figure out. So yeah, lots of really great stuff in this book. I've really enjoyed reading this. It feels very foundational. Like, just we've interviewed a lot of ThoughtWorks folks and read a lot of their books, and this is something that really echoes strongly in the ThoughtWorks DNA. And just there's a lot of patterns in the industry that are both that come from this book, and this book also does a good job of identifying some of the successful patterns in this industry that maybe didn't come from the book, but have proliferated. Like we talk about the Amazon 2 pizza team, right? And so, I mean, I think this book gives you a really, like, it's very, it's very pertinent to the industry, right? It's not like we talked about last week. It's tonal whiplash from hypermedia systems, which is very much like a love letter and a dream. And wouldn't it be nice if something could be like this? This book is very much like, this is what's currently happening. And this is how to kind of operate within that context. Lots of cool stuff in here. We'll take a quick break, and then we're going to begin our discussion on kind of the meat of part 3. And we are back. So part 3, just 2 chapters, chapter 7, chapter 8. But, like we said, this book is very meaty, lots of stuff to talk about here. Chapter 7 is all about the different team interaction modes. They list 3 different team interaction modes and say that, 99% of the time, this is how teams should be working with each other. And then, I thought this was interesting because as I was reading through these interaction modes, I definitely recognized when I've worked with teams in this capacity. So we can just start going through them one at a time. The first interaction mode is collaboration, which is working closely together with another team. Nathan, what are your thoughts on the collaboration mode? How they describe it, if you've ever kind of worked in this capacity?
Yeah, this is kind of cool. It can kind of come in a couple of ways, right? We've seen this with like embedded teams, like maybe somebody from the platform team is embedded with a stream aligned team. They're collaborating so much that they just need to iterate very quickly, and there's domain expertise from both that if they can, collaborate, then they can just move and iterate very quickly. The other one is that maybe it's not embedded, but it's like a project where the two teams are working really closely. This is probably going to feel very familiar with folks because I think it's a very natural way of interacting. I also like that this book frames it on like, okay, well, what happens if you're doing too much collaboration or there's too much hand holding? Maybe sometimes it can hide a dysfunction that's happening in the organization. So I thought that was really valuable for it to call that out.
Yeah, have you ever worked with a team in this capacity in kind of that collaboration mode?
Yeah, so this is very familiar. If my background again is like being on the platform team, we do this a lot. So there's another interaction that it's called facilitating, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But a lot of times when we're trying to maybe introduce self-service platforms, or we're trying to help a team get their tooling bootstrapped to a point that they can retroactively use these self-service platforms that we're trying to build out, we'll probably collaborate pretty closely. This might be like, hey, we need to streamline how your CI/CD Docker build process works, or maybe telemetry has a gap and they can't measure the health of their application. They're kind of struggling with this, and so maybe we'll collaborate to make sure that it's tooled out in a way so that moving forward they can self-service, they can handle this themselves, they meet expectations. And so I love collaboration. I mean, I'm just like a very collaborative type of person, and it's really neat because I always learn something as well, right? As a platform engineer, I would learn what business problem they're trying to solve, or strange and unique aspects of their application that maybe our platform wasn't serving properly. Which is, that's where the two-way street comes from. In that, what about you? What collaboration opportunities have you had?
I think it's interesting, right? Because we're talking to our audience right now. And if you haven't read the book, you're like, collaboration, like what? Like, yeah, I collaborate with other teams all the time. Like, I assume that was the point of another team. And we're going to talk about the two other types of team interaction modes that they talk about. But collaboration, I thought the way they described it was interesting. It says the collaboration team mode is suitable where a high degree of adaptability or discovery is needed, particularly in exploring new technologies or techniques. The collaboration interaction mode is good for rapid discovery of new things because it avoids costly handoffs between teams. And this is the example they give. For instance, perhaps there's a significant innovation in a space that spans the expertise of two systems, Team A and Team B, such as cloud-based sensor management with wearable devices. The collaborative mode requires good alignment and a high appetite and ability for working together between teams. And so what really marks a collaborative team is kind of two teams functioning as one. There's a lot of handoff between them. I mean, I am right in the thick of this at work. I work on marketing technology for our company. So we do a lot of work to let people identify customer segments. So like if you wanted to know all the customers on that have used the website, that live in Milwaukee, that signed up for the premium version of the plan, right? We provide the technology to generate that list for you, and then we provide some developer experience tooling so you can act on those lists. And so we work like hand in glove with the team that sends out email notifications, right? And so they grab those lists of customers from us and then they act on it, like to the point that our UI is just built into their product. We just share one big code base together. So it is very collaborative. And they mention some of the challenges that come with that, and I'm seeing some of the challenges with it. They mentioned Conway's Law. They say, furthermore, Conway's Law tells us that with the discovery and rapid learning that comes from the collaboration mode, the responsibilities and architecture of the software will tend to be more blended together. And like a case in point, like our code base just we have the same code base. They're separated, we each have our own files, but I find it tricky sometimes. Like, they own the code base, and so we don't have any control over like the CI/CD process or anything like that. We perpetually feel like guests in it. They're a fantastic team and have never given us any trouble. But it's always nice when you feel like you have strong ownership over what you're working on. So I mean, yeah, like, I think this is. Would you say this is kind of the default team interaction? Like, if you haven't thought about it too hard, do teams just wind up working this way?
And they talk about this, and it's interesting too, because I think maybe in this book, a platform team, if your default mode is collaboration, it may actually show a sign of dysfunction. They actually argue that they have an interesting table in here, and they basically say stream-aligned teams. So maybe we'll take a step back. There's 4 types of teams that we're talking about.
Yeah, we talked last week, but good to review.
So stream-aligned teams, these are things that you can think of as like feature teams that are building core business logic and stuff like that. Enablement teams, complicated subsystem teams, what they consider optional, but if you have a very complex thing, like let's say you have a custom SQL database or some Linux kernel stuff that your company's doing, you probably have a team that's like domain experts in this. And then a platform team. And the platform team, of course, is like come out of the DevOps world, but they should try to be building something as a service, like platform as a service, sort of internally. And in their chart, they actually say the typical behavior for collaboration should actually happen amongst stream-aligned teams, right? That these are these business teams that are trying to solve some problems. They could, yes, you can provide your stream aligned service as a service, and that's if you have good clear separation, that's probably read the API docs, read the SDK docs, and use the other service that's in your company, or that you need to be collaborating. Very rarely they say you should be facilitating, and we can go over those in a little bit. Collaboration, though, they really say should be occasional for platform, complicated subsystems, and enablement.
Yeah.
Meaning that ideally your typical behavior is going to be in those other 2 categories that we haven't gotten to yet. And I think maybe this gives us a good segue into the next category.
Before we move on, I just want to touch on the idea. They talk about cognitive overload or cognitive overhead when in collaboration. They say the cognitive load of ongoing collaboration can be much higher than working period inside the team's natural area. This means the communication overhead is going to be higher, possibly resulting in the apparent reduction of team effectiveness when viewed as a single team.
Right.
And I know I felt this before, right? You're working really closely with another team, but you have to take on all of their domain knowledge, and you're switching back and forth between the two. I like that this book frequently mentions the challenges of cognitive load. I think sometimes in poorly run companies, you can think of developers as fungible widgets, and you can just pluck them off of one assignment and move them on to another. And what does it matter? But even though Uncle Bob warns us against it, there is the flow state, and that is valuable. So yeah, I thought that was a challenge. A challenge they called out with collaborative or this collaborative mode of teams working together.
And I've seen this again, with my experience in platform engineering. A lot of platform should be as complex as it must, but it doesn't have to be some end-to-end seamless perfect thing. So certain companies, let's say you're adopting Kubernetes, and I've heard this complaint a lot. We always try to figure out the right abstraction, which is that software engineers don't want to be YAML wrangling, right? They don't want to sit there and spend a bunch of time figuring out how a Kubernetes manifest functions. And so platform team, obviously, we're trying to provide as a service. How do I give you the minimum amount of like expression that you have to do to understand how your service operates without having to become like a Kubernetes expert to self-serve? And I think that's that cognitive overload. It's like, oh man, do I really have to become like basically a in-house DevOps expert to do a basic service endpoint? And I think that's the struggle that happens when maybe the way that you're doing abstractions gets a little funky. So yeah.
I mean, so that brings us a little to the second team form of collaboration, X as a service. Clear responsibilities with predictable delivery, but needs good product management. That's how they describe it. And the first paragraph in this section, they say the X as a service team interaction mode is suited to situations where there is a need where one or more teams use a code library, component, API, or platform that just works without much effort, where a component or aspect of the system can be effectively provided as a service by a distinct team or group of teams. I imagine, Nathan, your experience in platform engineering, that this is probably a mode of interaction you've dealt with a lot.
Yeah, and this is the ideal, right? So this is the way that platform reduces cognitive load. And I'll tell you that when you're trying to bootstrap your platform as a service tooling, you will have to start with collaboration, because some of it is like you maybe don't know the problem that you're trying to solve, and it's not a one size fits all. There's the organizational norms, there's technical debt that you have to overcome, and so you might come in with this like shiny platform as a service that you think you're solving problems, and you realize it's not platform serviceable because there's some design decisions that have kind of gotten in the way. Maybe they've been building Docker containers that have a ton of state in it or something crazy, and you're like, yeah, we can't schedule this. Like, there's a lot of weird assumptions of, you've embedded keys and, environment aware stuff, and we have to maybe collaborate and say, okay, let's strip out and make this environment agnostic, and you can just inject this at runtime, right? Like we kind of have that collaborative conversation. Ideally, though, as a service, we can set these expectations and say, hey, here's what we expect. So if we were hands off and not collaborating, we're a bigger company, let's say, we say, look, to be on this service, here's the expectations of how this should operate. We give them a lot of better platform, even have these things called scorecards. And scorecards will show your production readiness. So it's a self-service way for you to go and automate this idea that, hey, if you get 80% of these things, then we'll put you in the silver status, and you can deploy to dev. And if you get to bronze, we'll let you go to staging. And if you get all the way to gold, then we say that you're safe to go to production. And you end up getting this whole thing called like a service catalog. And there's all these things that kind of come out of platform. And you can imagine this is the abstraction, is that like, hey, we would love to enable a team that doesn't have to go and check in and do the traditional DevOps thing of getting like a blessing. We'd much rather you have like a self-service checklist, set of expectations, and you just do it on your own. And so that's typically how a platform team should operate. And so we might build some custom in-house tools that say, like, let's make it one click to bootstrap the scaffolding for a new project. And that way the defaults are kind of sane defaults that they go in, and you can go from there. And they actually argue that 3 of the 4 teams, this is a typical abstraction interface that you should shoot for, right? Streamline teams. So if you have an auth service, or if you're doing the shopping cart checkout process or something, ideally you have a very clear delineation of like, how do I get into the shopping cart? How does the shopping cart close out and process a payment or whatever, right? If it's mature, you shouldn't have to go and collaborate when you want to implement a feature. Ideally, it's, you look at something like the Stripe docs, or AWS's whole thing is about service abstraction. So I don't have to go and like collaborate with the database team. If I want to spin up a new database, I just look at the API docs on like how to use that. And same with the complicated subsystems, right? So let's say you're running like a custom virtual machine inside of your organization. Ideally, that should have as, virtual machine as a service abstraction. You shouldn't have to know and collaborate on all the inner workings. Again, to reduce cognitive load, it should be something that you can read the docs and go from.
Another example they use is like a search algorithm or a recommendation algorithm, right?
Yeah.
That might be very complicated, heady stuff that you need a special team to tackle. At the end of the day, I would hope there's an API that says, I give you this keyword, you give me the recommendations, right? Or I give you this profile.
Here's how to point the indexer at the unstructured data. This is how to say that the indexing process is done, and here's how you run queries against it, right? Like, hopefully that like what you would do, and you don't have to understand all the magical, mystical things that are happening under the hood. And so that, again, that would be, search as a service, or, indexing as a service.
Yeah, this is one of those methods of collaboration that when it works really well. One thing I like about this is there's a very natural model for it. You can just look at any of the other professional APIs you consume. Like, again, like we're not collaborating closely with Stripe every single day. We just have their documentation and know how to implement their APIs. Um, when I worked at one of the big cloud providers, I mean, this was how that place worked to a T. Our product, it was a private networking product. I think I've explained this before, but it was basically it was a frontline product. You could buy it, like any of the other services that they offered. But it was if you had a virtual private cloud, you had a subnet of instances running within it. You wanted those instances separated from the public internet for some reason, but you still wanted to interact with the cloud provider's services, like their storage service or their database service or whatever. You could provision a connection point between your instance that's walled off from the public internet, but the kind of like the version running on the internal network of our service. And so, you could like ping google.com if you were in there and no traffic would get out, but you could, list all of your, virtual computer instances and it would work. This is all getting tough because I'm trying to keep it provider agnostic. But anyhow, that product was really like a Frankenstein of a lot of other subsystems within the team. Like the actual routing of the traffic from because that's the secret sauce, right? It's like, how do we guarantee that when you make a request, we're routing the traffic not across the public internet, but across the cloud provider's internal network, all based within that data center. That was another team. We provisioned what was called the code name for that team, or not code name, but just like name was Peregrine. And so we provisioned what was called a Peregrine attachment. And then, and I wish I had learned all the nitty gritty about how exactly that worked, but for some reason, attaching that to your endpoint would tell it when traffic was, when the traffic requests were made to route it along the internal network. We needed to provision like network interfaces within the cloud instances to provide IP addresses. That wasn't something we took care of. There was a whole network interfaces team, and they had an API that we used. And it's actually great because one of the projects I worked on when I was there was allowing people to select the IP address for their endpoints rather than be automatically assigned. And the network interface team that was just like a parameter in their
that's cool.
In their API was like, hey, if you provide an IP address, we'll see if it's available and give it to you, right? You would think that would be an easy feature to make. No, it took 6 months.
Right.
Because that is how things go with those big cloud providers. I wish that our team at my current place was better at this. We actually just had an outage because the email platform team, like I said, that we collaborate very closely with, theoretically, I would like to be much closer to this, where they're consuming our service as a platform. We'll never get 100% there, but we should be better there. But we just had an outage because they were consuming our service as a platform, or they basically make a call to get like some profile attributes or something. It's not important. The second call is important, which is that they then need to query, for some reason, all of our attribute metadata, like all of it, all 700 different attributes. And we found out that if any of that attribute metadata is wrong or invalidly formatted, it throws an error and stops the whole email sending process, which I thought was nutso. We had accidentally let some bad data get in, which like, hey, that's our fault. Our validation wasn't working. I don't think you should have to validate every single metadata, before you successfully perform an action that doesn't have anything to do with that metadata. But then I was like, this is crummy code. Like, why did they write it this way? And then they told us, like, we didn't write it. You guys wrote it. Like, we didn't know how to do this. And so we asked your team to do it. And this was like a year or two ago. And they wrote this code. And I was frustrated because I was like, why didn't we write it better? Or why didn't we realize as soon as we were making all these like weird Frankenstein-y API calls that we should have realized our API was broken, and we should have fixed this in the back end so that the front end could just do it. It's just classic like hack job. Got to get it done quick. But I think that's an example of one. We want to be platform, X as a service. that's what we want our product to be. But it wasn't working well enough that they couldn't just do it on their own. We had to write the code, and then we wrote crummy code. So we kind of failed in this X as a service model, and then that put us into a collaboration model. And then we didn't collaborate particularly well. So yeah, just a cascading series of failures. It's been fun at work lately. We've had a lot of incidents.
Yeah, we're trying to launch. We're launching some new technologies, and they kind of coincide. And there's like this weird chicken and the egg problem that we have of like figuring out exactly which order of operations we need to launch things so that it makes sense for the other teams. And so normally we're like highly decoupled, but we're pretty coupled on some important things. So they've kind of just built up. They're like projects that are important. We have to get them done right. There's like code audits and a bunch of fuzzing work and a bunch of other things. And we realize that there's these like cascading dependency graphs that just emerge when we realize there's like some showstopper. So it's been interesting and a lot of back and forth. So this gets into the third, category for this section, which is called facilitating mode. And facilitating mode is that one team, usually the enablement team, facilitates another team in learning or adopting a new approach. And that's pretty abstract. You have to kind of read the book to understand what we're talking about. So let me do a quick summary of what an enablement team is. So an enablement team is a team that assists other teams in adopting or modifying software as part of a transition or during a learning period. And so it's funny, like when I talk about platform, and they'll even talk about this in the book, there might even be like a platform enablement team, right? So maybe we do need to be a little more hands-on because this other team doesn't understand how to use open telemetry, or doesn't understand distributed stack traces, right? Like there's some fundamental like learning that needs to happen that if we just threw them out there, maybe they don't understand how to do proper annotations, or that there might be a, some sort of cool helper library that wires this up for you, or does these other things. Ideally, only an enablement team should be doing their typical behavior, should be doing facilitation, meaning that occasionally another stream aligned team can do facilitating. So that's like, let's say you're the auth team or something, and you're spinning up a new greenfield team is spinning up a new service, and maybe you need a little hand holding because you're maybe not quite at the auth as a service abstraction. There's a little bit of cognitive load that you need to help the team understand. Maybe there's something unique about your auth that isn't out in the greater world. Occasionally you should be doing some facilitating there, is what they're arguing in this book. Otherwise, this enablement team, these folks that kind of float around and enable projects to get unblocked, should be the ones operating here. They actually leave complicated subsystems and platform off of facilitation. So I think that's interesting, and might be a sign of dysfunction of teams that I've been in the past, because I think sometimes platform has been platform and enablement, and maybe that's a bad abstraction. Yeah.
Yeah. I was just thinking about my first job. I guess my first full-time job. I had a school job doing development before this. They kind of tried to do something like this, almost like an embedded enablement. Like another division of the company was trying to build like this big app, and like I said, I kind of worked. It was called reference architecture. We were like a weird hodgepodge. Like we were trying to do platform stuff. We were also trying to do enablement stuff. None of it was working particularly well. I shouldn't say that. I think when we had too heavy of a hand. The stuff we were building was good, but we had too heavy of a hand in making people use it. Anyhow, and I remember this other team was trying to build like this big new internal app, and so we embedded an engineer in their team kind of to work in this way. It's different because it's not a team on team interaction, but it's one person from our team getting embedded in their team. He was the intern before me, and this guy was like a whiz kid. Like he was absolutely fantastic, regularly outshined the senior developers on our team. Everyone knew he was just so bright and so smart and was going to do whatever he wanted, particularly at that company and with his life. I still aspire to to be like him, and not like current him, like him a year out of school. Like he was just a great engineer. I was not a good engineer. I've had a real glow up in my career, one might say, but at the beginning I was really, really struggling, and not taking it as seriously as I should. Anyhow, this is one of the things that, like, when it happened at the time, I felt really bad, but now I'm like, this was so dumb. Why did they even do this? They decided to move him off that team. You know, that's building kind of like this big critical internal app. But they need to replace him with, so they replaced him with me. And it's like going from driving a Ferrari to driving like some crummy Toyota Corolla or something. Like, I just could not at any level provide any of the services or help that he was providing them. And the team was pissed. Like, and I felt really bad that I couldn't live up to him. And in hindsight, I'm like, that was so dumb. Why on earth would you make that decision? And like one of those funny things, like, treat developers as like fungible resources. So I've worked in the sense where, like, I was supposed to be facilitating this team in a way. I had been out of school for 6 months. Total disaster. The whole thing kind of broke down. Not my
I would argue though that wasn't your fault. So
I think so. I thought it was at the time.
The two things that I see out of this is, number one, leadership obviously didn't understand what they had going on, and number two, I've seen this happen before. There's certain engineers who they basically live in hero mode, and they can keep so many variables in their mind that they can actually like, they're basically like a muxer for, you know, a router in your server, and they can just like literally just see the pattern, come up with a solution, unblock a team. And the bad thing about this is that you basically have made this both a bottleneck and a single point of failure for how the organization functions. And it's really important that you don't, if you're not going to keep this person there long term, it's a real risk, because again, there's the, like, what happens if they won the lottery or they get hit by a bus kind of a thing, right? It's an organizational failure if one resource going away causes things to break. It means you haven't structured your teams properly. This is like sort of, and I'm not saying anything. I'm sure that person is like amazing and prolific. And I've seen those folks as well. I've seen this actually happening organizationally, where, like, I can internalize complex systems, but there are folks that can like do 10x more variables than I can, right? Like, maybe I can keep track of like 15 or so kind of moving parts in my mind and kind of reason about the system. And there are folks that can probably keep 50 or 60 moving parts in their mind and just have a mental model. And those people they're freaks. Like, they really are, in a positive way. It's amazing to watch their brain work. And but if you structure the success or failure of your team on the ability to do 50 variables at once, you're just setting yourself up for failure, right? Like, it really is a real red flag, in my opinion. And especially because that person can burn out, right? That's the other part of it. And that may have been why they moved them. They either had a really complex issues.
I bet that's right. You know, this is cathartic. This is good for me. I needed to revisit these. And you know what's funny about all of that is he is still a very gifted engineer. I'm not sure, you know, I'm not involved in his day-to-day work. What I do know is he is still with that company. He has moved up quickly for someone, you know, for someone in that company. But the funny thing is like, I was a lot worse at that job, and then because I was worse at that job, I think I mentioned this on the podcast before, but layoffs. It was the travel industry during COVID. Like, I just drew the short straw, and I'm sure, you know, if my performance had been better, I would have had less of a chance of drawing a short straw. Anyhow, who knows? But yeah, like, that was kind of it was losing that first job that really kickstarted my professional growth and made me say, like, okay, I should take this seriously.
Right.
And yeah, like, now, I mean, I looked this up on LinkedIn. Like, I would be shocked if I weren't earning more than him, which, you know, that's not everything, but I believe my title is higher than his. And if anything, that's a mistake of my companies that have employed me, because this guy, or it's not a mistake of the company that employed me. It's a mistake of the company that's still employing him, because he is a genius and should be running the whole dang thing at this point. was just one of those funny things where I'm like, it's funny. If I'd been better at that job, I'd probably be doing worse in my career at this point because I would have stagnated. Um, but yeah,
But
that's
at the same time, though, it's interesting to see where somebody shines and where somebody doesn't. I don't know.
that's true, right?
There's this thing called the Peter principle, which is
Yeah,
that you can be promoted into incompetence, right? So
yeah.
you look around and you go, why are these managers suck? Like, why are
Mhm.
they're like no good? And what happened is that they've been promoted to one level beyond where they're actually highly competent,
It's
right?
like Michael Scott in The Office, who was a fantastic salesman and then is promoted to be a terrible manager.
Right. Right. And so, and yet for some reason, that one's a funny one though, because like, even though he's a terrible manager objectively in some ways, he was the opposite of that when the company started doing a bunch of layoffs and doing these other things.
Yeah,
Like he really cared about everyone. And then they also were like the top performing
yeah.
office and nobody knew why. And it was because like you look at it and you're like, any management consultant would go, this guy's terrible. What are you
Yeah.
doing? But of course, he also wanted everyone to be his best friend, which I've had bosses like that before, and that is
It's rough.
not fun. I've definitely been, yeah. So one of the things that I think that they kind of open up this idea of doing, they open up the idea of using collaboration, X as a service, and facilitation. What I love about the next chapter, and this is where I think they really just drive home. They've been building up everything up to chapter 8 and the conclusion. They start giving you tactical ways of addressing the effectiveness of these teams and looking for pitfalls of what can go wrong. And you have to remember, right? The big thesis here is small teams empowered to make decisions and do things autonomously outperform teams that are just crippled with having to over communicate and collaborate and spend several years trying to come up with a single feature. And some of these really spoke to me, and I don't know which part you want to address first, but I really liked the way that they drove home how IT effectiveness and how to get started with Team Topologies was like, it was like a cool checklist as far as, hey, here's how you even make the first step, or here's how you're going to need several iterations to even get started on this.
What? Yeah, I'm looking through the book right now. What were you talking about specifically with that checklist?
Yeah. So one of the things, I guess there were some case studies that I liked a lot. One of them was, I forget which company it was. They were like, okay, we had this plan to move towards these team topologies to enable our teams. And we thought it was talking about getting away from traditional ops and traditional dev and eventually building this like sort of platform team. And they're like, okay, we think it'll take about a year to get this done. And then they realized it was going to take 3 years. It was like 3 years of them, they were like, oh, well, we'll embed these two teams, these sub teams together, and they're going to collaborate really closely so they can build out this new piece. And they talk about these streams of change, right? So there might be this idea that, like, okay, we don't have the right abstraction on containers. Let's just pretend. We know we want to go to Kubernetes. We want to go to containers. Right now, we're still using, Ansible and building virtual machines from a bunch of bash scripts, right? So there's some gap. And I've actually been in this world before where like somebody who builds these like unique snowflake machines for each one of their environments and then has to try to bridge across the chasm into containerization. It's a huge cognitive jump for some of these teams, right? They're just so used to these like weird multi-stage virtual machine custom builds that you actually have to have like a new enablement team that kind of gets embedded and starts coming up with like, oh, do we secretly start building a mirror image of a container next to the virtual machine and then slowly like build these things in. They actually, for like from a platform standpoint, what stood out to me, one of the things they talk about is you start with creating a team, right? You identify what's called a stream of change, or like the thing you want to change, and then you create what they call the thinnest viable platform.
Yes.
And again, I liked this because they weren't saying you don't need some end-to-end platform as a service. You literally need to say like, what's an abstraction that I can take cognitive load off of one of our engineering teams, but I can start providing some new abstraction to enable them to do some new thing. And it's very hands-on, right? Like early on, they're talking about how like you need to identify capability gaps. There might be some coaching and mentoring, and this again where things are really fuzzy and the alignment of teams. I think you'll see a real practical sense of this in Unicorn Project, right? You see this kind of emerge where some scrappy group is like, you know what, our end-to-end testing is terrible, so we're just going to do it. We're just going to get it, and we're going to see all these failing tests, and we're affecting change this way. And then I think then they say share and practice different interaction modes. And I think there's a lot of experimentation here because when you're starting to do this stuff, it takes a while to figure out what's actually going to work, right? You don't know. You have an idea. We need to change things. We'd like to have the 4 team types. We'd like to figure out the interface of collaboration. But again, you interpreting this book and then you're trying to see like, oh, well, how does it really work? Or what hidden pitfalls are going to actually come up? What's going to show their ugly head when we actually poke the bear and try to change things?
The software engineer's creed: we do things not because they are easy, but because we thought they were going to be easy.
Exactly.
I really liked. They talk about the triggers for evolution of team topologies.
Oh yeah.
Like when might you want to evolve your teams? They list a couple here. One of the triggers: your software has grown too large for one team. They list some of the symptoms. A startup company grows beyond 15 people, which they say is Dunbar's number. Other teams spend a lot of time waiting on a single team to undertake changes. Changes to certain components or workflows in the system routinely get assigned to the same people, even when they're already busy or away, or team members complain about lack of team or system documentation. They talk about delivery cadence becoming slower. That's another trigger. And they talk about multiple business services rely on a large set of underlying services. I thought this was a good, you got to include this in this book, right? Because you can't just say, here are the team topologies. And, I guess you could use them sometime. I like this idea, like, hey, like the reason these team topologies exist is because there are some real problems they can solve. And I think it's clever to frame this. Like, I think we've all dealt with these problems. And it's clever to frame it in a way where like, hey, if you're dealing with this problem, it's not unsolvable. That's a sign that you need to be reconsidering how your teams are structured. Have you ever dealt with any of these triggers, Nathan? Software grow too large for one team, delivery cadence.
And I'll say that especially when you're doing early stage startups or mid stage startups like I've been in, there's a lot of, well, first of all, leadership churn happens. It just, who's a good CEO when you're in seed and Series A? Every once in a while, you'll get some sort of iconic CEO who can make the full growth of the company. But sometimes leadership will swap out, right? Whether it's the CFO, it's CTO, CEO, and there's philosophical differences that happen. Also, as a company grows, what worked at one level of scale doesn't scale out, right? So let's say you do figure out product market fit, or at least how to cross a certain chasm, or the industry pivots. I've seen this happen as well. And it actually requires organizational shift, right? Like maybe I was at this airline software company I was working in. We shifted the type of problems that we were solving for the airline industry, and we had some acquisitions. So there's like 2 pieces. Number one is we're merging the cultures across acquisitions. Maybe there's a core team and a core technology that we needed to integrate, and maybe they did some things better than we did, or maybe we did some things that were better than them, and we need to figure out like, well, how do we work together? And so in a world where things are changing all the time, this is where this set of tools of like, how do you notice, like we did this. We started asking one of the companies that we acquired to start solving a problem for a new type of customer that they'd never had before. And then all of a sudden it turned out that their cadence dropped way down, right? That was the trigger of like, why can't they do anything? And they realized that they were in like planning meetings for, from a product standpoint of like figuring out how they even solve these types of problems, or maybe they're working with a size of airline that they've never worked with before. And then all of a sudden the software queuing system that worked fine for a mom and pop industry couldn't scale to the quantity and volume of other areas. And it triggered a bunch of conversations. How do teams work across each other? How do we get things unblocked? Are we using the right, like we were even like on Azure and AWS with one company, but we're on Google Cloud with another. There's like these fundamental things where all these assumptions had to be like questioned. It sounds like pure chaos, I'm sure, to the listener. But and some of these were, these are self-induced problems. Some of these we're asking a team to do something that they've never done before, and so we were constantly. My platform team was constantly challenged with, well, what's generally applicable? Like, can we actually generalize this across cloud providers, or are we asking them to switch cloud providers? Do they have the talent and resources to have streamlined teams that are unblocked, or are we realizing that what we're asking them to do is because they're tightly coupled across systems, and we actually have to go in and re-educate how to do streamlined teams in a more cloud native way or something like this. But
I like
it
the
is
idea of
interesting.
working.
Yeah.
I like the idea of working at a company like, hey, what are you on? AWS, Google Cloud, Azure, like all of them.
All of them, right? Or and we were in this weird spot where like we at one point the strategy was to take one of the biggest customers on the old platform and try to move them into modern best practices, versus, well, let's just put them in legacy mode and like just make sure that the train runs on time, but we'll greenfield with this new customer that actually needed our system and 3 others, and we'll actually just build it greenfield with all the modern best practices. And this was actually what I was advocating. I was like, hey, look, there's way too much unknown tech debt in this legacy system. I think it's a mistake. I think we should focus on this other new one. And who I reported to disagreed. And I lost that one. And I think if I had done a better job of like maybe talking to my skip or doing other things, that I could have made a more compelling case. After many months of delay, they ended up doing the thing I initially advocated, which was, hey, let's like have a new scrappy platform team. Let's get a core set of engineers who know that their software system really well, and let's let them do a lift and shift onto a new cloud platform, where we can put in these platform as a service patterns that we've had a lot of success with these other parts of our company.
You ever do? I'll have this feeling sometimes when I'm playing like Mafia or werewolf style games where you're like trying to find out like who's the traitor or whatever and like vote them off. Like occasionally I'll be like arguing with a friend, like this person's the traitor, and like, no, they're not. And like I'll finally say to my friend, like, okay, I'm going to agree with you. I'm going to vote your way just because I'm done arguing, and I still think I'm right, but I just want to tell you that you're wrong, right? Like, so we'll do the vote. Like, we'll do it your way, and I'll just have the like either you're right and we're right together, or you're wrong, and I get the smug satisfaction of telling you that you were wrong. And I feel that kind of like you're talking about this system.
And that's what it was. It was really interesting. Again, I wish I had read this book and or the Unicorn Project before I ended up leaving in frustration. Because maybe if I had read these 6 months or 8 months before, it would have given me a vocabulary and a system in which we should address these. I could have talked to leadership. And I think maybe this is an interesting sort of segue into, the conclusion and stuff here, which is that I wasn't in leadership. I didn't have the ability myself to do these things, but I did have the ear. Like, we'd had some early victories, and I think people were taking notice of the way that we were approaching stuff. I think if I had been able to use a vocabulary that could talk to management better and had a better way of measuring the way that we're really affecting change and talking about dysfunction and using this framing, I think things might have gone differently. And so even if you're not in management, but you want to impact management, this book actually is really useful so that you can put it in the vocabulary and the framing that they're in this domain of trying to problem solve and unblock and, do all the, have developer satisfaction, all these other things all the time. And if they haven't read these types of books, they might be using old methodology and they're frustrated because it worked for them in the past and it's not working now, and why. And so I think that's where these kind of books are healthy in kicking off this conversation, because they give you a framework that you can validate or invalidate hypotheses, right? I think if I create these 3 streams and have these stream aligned teams and build this platform as a service for this, then they'll be unblocked from each other and they're going to be able to ship faster. Well, you should be able to measure ship faster, right? You should be able to measure developer satisfaction, or that they're actually like shipping features that are in there. And this comes down to like what they call like developer productivity. The book doesn't really address this. There's a whole industry that's emerged out of this on measuring developer productivity and developer happiness.
One of the fascinating conundrums of software engineering that there still isn't a great way to measure developer productivity. Lots of people are trying, and it might be one of the things I kind of started my career after DevOps culture was the de facto mode of operation, or at least what people were striving towards. And so sometimes I'll hear older engineers kind of complaining about like they want us to do 3 jobs at the same time. You got to be full, front end, back end, and operations. I'm like, I don't know, isn't that just engineering? Like, isn't that just what you're supposed to do? So I kind of think like, yeah, like I just wasn't around for the before times. And so it's all just old hat to me. I wonder if we'll one day see kind of a revolution in measuring developer productivity, if we'll get some gold standards on like, hey, we've determined that this is like definitively what makes a developer productive. And if they, if new engineers 15 years from now might look back and be like, oh, that's so weird that we didn't, have the gub metric and, that governs everything.
What's interesting is I think there's organizations. So a lot of the folks who wrote like Accelerate and some of these other ones, they've actually gone into starting developer experience startups. So there's one called like GetDX. It's one I'm familiar with because we were implementing it at my last company. Their whole argument is it actually, every organization is different in the metrics that they should measure, but you really should pick a very small number of metrics that you think capture what a healthy engineering team is, and actually don't overmeasure. Don't try to get down to like commits per day, per developer, per project or something. Those give you a good indication. What you care about with those kind of things is a change in the rate. So like one team might be putting out, 20 PRs a week or something, and another team might only be putting out 5 PRs a week. That doesn't directly tell you that other team is 4 times more productive. You really want to know things like how many sub-zeros do they have? Are you in a state? Are you just trying to keep the system stable versus doing a bunch of new feature, innovation? But really what you care about is the rate of change, right? If the team that's doing 5 a week drops to 1 a week for 4 weeks, something's happened. Something's going on, right? If the team that's doing 20 a week hops up to 30 a week or something, right? We know that it's the rate of change that we actually care more about. And the other one is that like there's also like qualitative and quantitative analysis that I think is important. So how in control of your schedule do you feel, right? That's maybe not that's not a quantitative thing, but maybe you feel like things are spiraling out, or maybe how much deep focus time do you have in a week, right? These are actually really important questions, because if you feel like, even if your team's cranking out a quote unquote a bunch of features, but you don't feel like you have much control over your deep focus time, we know that that's dysfunction. We know that you're being pulled into too many meetings, that you're probably breaking some of the boundaries that Team Topologies talks about. And you're going to get burned out. You're going to have things that happen, because we know that regardless of the organization and the details, if I feel like I have control over my time, if I feel like I can give input to my leadership, and if I feel like I have deep focus time, that's a healthy environment for an engineer. And how you measure that comes up, I think, organization to organization.
Absolutely. I think one last thing I'd like to touch on before we kind of close out, we mentioned this at the top, but they are realistic, and they have a whole section called Team Topologies Alone Are Not Sufficient for IT Effectiveness. I'll just put in their words. They say the Team Topologies approach to software systems represents a major step forward for many organizations around the world, providing insights into how and why different team combinations and interactions work and when to use them, along with practical advice and patterns to follow in specific circumstances. However, Team Topologies alone will not produce an effective software delivery and operations organization. Beyond the structures and dynamics described in the book, important additional ingredients of success include, and they list a couple different things here. They say a healthy organizational culture, good engineering practices. They list things like test first design, CI/CD, healthy funding and financial practices. This isn't something I had considered. I've just worked at a lot of places where they've kind of figured this out. But, they have a whole section early in the book about whether or not you're allocated to CapEx or OpEx. I can imagine startups, even knowing if you're going to have money coming in is a huge deal.
Right.
And then clarity of business vision. It says the executive or leadership provides a clear, non-conflicting vision and direction for the rest of the organization.
Early stage startups really struggle with this last two. I've been in organizations where they're completely transparent and they're like, hey, we've got 6 months of runway. You don't want to be in that situation, but we've got 6 months of runway if you don't figure this thing out or if I don't get their next round of funding. And it does, it weighs on you because you're like 1 foot in, oh, wow, we really have to build some amazing stuff. And the other one on, I have to take care of my family. And should I be kind of like putting my feelers out? And I've been in this situation before where like I actually left a startup where I'd only been there 7 months, but I realized they had a pretty short runway. And in my mind, I'm thinking, oh, they're going to run out of cash. Like I didn't have faith that they were going to do it. Now, what's funny is the CEO was amazing, super scrappy guy. And he had a plan he hadn't shared with anybody, but it's understandable, but they got acquired by a major unicorn and did some amazing stuff with it. And the core team got taken care of. But I didn't have faith that the funding situation was going to be okay. And then clarity of vision, right? Early stage, you're trying to figure out. We always joke you're throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks.
Yeah.
It's distracting, right? If you have a CEO with a strong personality and a very clear vision, you know exactly what you're supposed to work on, even if you've gotten no instructions. That's amazing. You feel so high functioning in that environment. If you're like, what are we even doing? And every week a new idea comes in and we're kind of like running around like a chicken with their head cut off. It wears down on you after a while. You're like, what are we even doing here? So yeah.
There's a little bit with these 4 where it's like that subreddit, like draw the rest of the freaking owl. Have you ever seen that? Where it's like, it's making fun of like, like those like drawing instructions, like how to draw an owl. It's like step 1, draw a circle. Step 2, draw the rest of the freaking owl. Like right. There's a little bit of that with here. Like you're all your team topologies now. Granted, here's what you need first. It was like these 4 incredibly difficult to achieve things.
Right.
But like this book is not called How to Have the Perfect Company, right? This book is called Team Topologies and does its job very well. I just think it's funny. It's kind of tucked in at the end here. Like,
no, you're right.
By the way, if you don't have these 4 things, maybe do those first.
Are you? You're like, oh man, we need to fix our team topologies because our organization's not healthy right now. They're like, well, if your organization's not healthy, none of this might work. Okay, thanks.
But overall, I mean, a good book. I've enjoyed it, and like I said, I feel like this is one of those books you hear about a lot, and so it's great. And if one of the things we're learning from doing this podcast, and this isn't specific to this book, but more general advice, just like there are so many things you hear a lot about in like books you might hear about, and their philosophies affect the day-to-day, your day-to-day work in software engineering. I'm like, just read the book. Like it didn't take us very long to read Team Topologies. We hear about it a lot. Like read it, find out what it's actually saying, right? We've got to give clean code its day in court one day, just because everyone talks about that book.
Divisive too.
Right? I know, right? Refactoring was another one of those books that you hear about a lot, and it's just really cool that I've had conversations, and we're all having conversation with each other as people who have heard about the book. And it's cool to come into the conversation as not just someone who's heard about the book or the ideas in it, but it's actually read the book. So, if any of those kind of popular books you kind of that kind of float through the software engineering ether, like just take the time to read it. It's worth your time.
I also really love, I think I was the startup scaling for web scalability for startup engineers also had this section. There's like a recommended reading section at the end of this book. And obviously it's I'm a little biased because we're a podcast that reads engineering books, but this is so nice. Like it's really cool. Like I'm already going in here and like comparing what do we already have in our backlog and which one should we throw in the backlog, because it's this like, oh, do you need key management concepts? Here's some books we recommend. If there's approaches to software and systems, here's these books we recommend. Here's on enabling fast flow. And there's like these books we recommend. And much like the rest of this book, it's beautifully structured with summaries at the beginning and conclusions at the end. This is just another nice thing that they mention all of these books sort of in passing as you go through the text. And I end up highlighting these because I'm always looking for things to put in our backlog. But it's just nice. Like I just appreciate a single page, a one pager of all the recommended reading from here.
Absolutely. Well, we always like to ask at the end, what are we going to do differently in our careers because we read this book? Nathan, how about you this week?
Yeah, we didn't talk about it a ton here, but in the approach to how to do this, identifying suitable streams of change. And suitable stream, I didn't have a term for this, but I've talked about swim lanes, parallel swim lanes of how can I have a team that can work autonomously on some area of focus with minimal, collaboration points that have to go between them. I'm always looking for these. I'm going to use some of the techniques that they identify here for companies that are struggling to give these clear streams. So that's one area that I'm like, okay, cool. I'm going to try some of the methodology that they gave us for suitable streams of change.
Yeah, I want to get better at identifying when teams may have naturally run their course and are in need of a shakeup. They have, that whole section like triggers for when you might want to evolve your team topologies. Now, there's a balancing act here because, they call it psychopathy to mix, to destroy teams that are working well. So you can't just go and I think all of us have been subject to the dreaded reorg. But we've also been, I think a lot of us have been in situations where you're working on a team that is just clearly struggling. And you might think, oh, if only we had a better manager, or if only we were more up to the challenges at hand. But maybe that's not the case. Maybe your team is kind of fundamentally doing the wrong thing. And so I want to be more aware of when that's happening and then be more aware of the different topologies, just the tools in the toolkit for how you could maybe adjust that. And we also like to ask, who would you recommend this book to? Nathan, what are you thinking?
Sometimes when we do multi-week, we kind of amend or change our recommendations of who this book's for. This is not one of those cases. I think we both identified this, which is that engineering leadership, tech leads, software architects, engineering managers, and then specifically VPs and above. This really is a playbook for leadership. I think this would be really useful if you have the ear of leadership and you want to make a case for it. You really have to have grassroots adoption of these to work, and it has to have organizational sponsorship. Same thing is true with developer experience. When I was working with that other org, they couldn't even engage with us until I had VP level sponsor or champion. I think this is exactly the same with Team Topologies. You need an executive sponsor to pull this off.
Yeah, agreed 100%. Maybe you just have a real natural interest in management subjects, even if you're kind of junior in your career. It's a great book for you too, but I think the people who are going to get the most mileage out of it are exactly like you said, engineering leadership, especially VPs and C-suite. And that takes us to the end of Team Topologies. Good book. Glad we read it. And we hope that you enjoyed the discussion. You can always keep up with us at Book Overflow Pod on Twitter or X or whatever you want to call it. You can find us. You can contact us at contact@bookoverflow.io. I'm on Twitter at Carter Morgan. Nathan does his work with his newsletter Functionally Imperative at functionallyimperative.com. And yeah, as always, we love hearing from you. And help keep this podcast going. We'll keep it going as long as people are listening. And so far, not only are you listening, but we are growing. And that is so fun for us. So until next week, we will see you around. Actually going to stop. Okay, it stopped. Oh, something went wrong.
Uh-oh.